moment to the book of Acts in the 14th chapter. I'm going to be reading from it in just a moment. Do appreciate the presence of all this evening. It is encouraging to see you out, and I don't have the words to properly express my appreciation for your enabling me to go on this trip, the support that you've offered, the financial, the emotional, the spiritual, the prayers that have been offered. It was great encouragement to me, and I really do appreciate that more than I can express. In Acts the 14th chapter, when Paul and Barnabas were finishing up that first journey, it said that from Adelaide they sailed to Antioch, verse 26, where they had been commended to the grace of God for the work which they had completed. Have you ever thought about that expression? That they had been commended to the grace of God for this work. That without God's blessings, without His grace, without His help, we can accomplish nothing. Then he says, now when they had come and gathered the church together, they reported all that God had done with them, that He had opened the door of faith to the Gentiles. Though I will be talking about places I went and things that we did, I hope that I don't forget that it was God working in us. And I hope to stress that to you. And I want you to remember this. Everywhere we went, Oakland was going, because it was your support that helped me to go. We went to see men that this church supports on a regular basis. And so as I talk about some of those churches, we'll be talking about things that are done by this group. But I want to just give you a quick overview of Zimbabwe. And maybe you already know all of this. Back when I was in school, this was called Southern Rhodesia. And it is south of the equator, north of the Tropic of Capricorn, which means it's in the tropics. But it's also, most of the country is on a plateau. In fact, the capital, Harare, is about 4,800 feet above sea level. So the climate is more of a subtropical climate. It's the winter there right now, which means their winters rarely get rain. I'll talk about that word rarely in a few moments. But it's usually very dry. If the sun comes out, it'll warm up during the day, but it cools off very quickly at night. And on this trip we traveled, there were 6 of us. Steve Klein from East Side, Tad Quarter, who's at Jennings Chapel, Lowell Salee over here at Anderson, myself. Then Joe Greer, Jody's dad, was on the trip. He joined us in Atlanta. And a man named Kevin Morrow, who is a friend of Lowell's from Bowling Green, Kentucky, he joined us on this. But we make the little short jump to Atlanta, and then we travel 8,377 miles, 15 hours on a plane to Johannesburg. If you've never flown for 15 straight hours, let me just tell you, if you can avoid it, don't do it. That part is not fun, you know. Then the next day, it takes us from Monday night to Tuesday night to get to Johannesburg. The next day we fly up to Harare, and that was a breeze. It was an hour and 45 minutes. Then we get in a car and we drive to Chivu. Now, I say we. Let me just give you a quick. At Johannesburg, Joe and Tad, they went to Zambia. They worked in the country north of us for a week. When we arrived in Harare, the capital of Zimbabwe, Lowell and Kevin, they went to Matare, and Steve was stuck with me for a little while. We did a lot of driving on this trip, and the roads are generally not very good over there. One thing I wanted to mention, and I think that as you read reports of men and requests for support, it helps to know this. Most things in Zimbabwe, compared to American prices, are pretty good. You can buy a Coke for less than $1 there. But gasoline, well, when you first see the sign, it's really impressive. It'll be something like $1.52. Like, wow, that's for a liter. You know, you work it out to gallons, it comes out to about $5.80 a gallon. That's expensive. Travel is expensive in that country, and that's one of the major expenses when we go over, is the local preachers drive us around. They can't afford to drive us all over the country at $5.80 a gallon, so we pay for the fuel, and in all of their work, that's involved. But in this country, I'm not going to get into a big history because it's not important to this study. This is not National Geographic. But when areas like this were colonized, they paid no attention to ethnic boundaries. Sometimes they threw together peoples who were various tribes, ethnicities. What is now Zimbabwe is predominantly a group of people called Shona. They speak the Shona language. They're about 84% of the population. Second largest group are the Ndebele. And then there are the Tonga and some other tribes. Among the people of that country, that creates some friction. You know, I can tell you that the Shona are not only the largest population group, they have pretty much run the government since independence. You know, the president's always Shona, on and on. And sometimes some of the others feel like, well, our part of the country gets neglected. I'm not going to delve into all of that, but that's just kind of an underlying thing. So when you're dealing with people who are from these different ones, you find that, to me, they all look the same, you know, and yet they do have some different qualities. You have to try to work with people a little differently. And you also, just like in the United States, you have to stress to people the importance of loving one another, even if they are from a different tribe, have a different primary language. And let me stress primary. It was a British colony. In the schools, English is taught. Most younger people, and when I say younger, you know, from about 40 down, most of them can speak some English. But the fact is, they don't use that as their primary language, and so they struggle with it a little bit. But all the signs and things are in English. First place we landed was Harare, and then from there we went to Chifu. And that was a good little drive, and in this next photo, you find sin everywhere. You know, I had to get on to this man. Darlington is the fellow on the left. He is a fine young preacher, to me, one of the most impressive men there. I did get him to repent and take that shirt off. I will tell you that it's kind of funny. You will see things like this Tennessee shirt. I've seen Gator shirts. And they have no idea what those are. They just find them, they're cheap at a secondhand place, thrift stores. If some flaw in it, you know, manufacturers here send them over there. But I did want to show you something here to give you an idea of the typical life of somebody in the rural areas. This is a cooking hut. And I took a picture. There's Steve. There's Reason Marara. When we're on the Shona side, he's kind of the right-hand man. Steve has known him a long time. He serves as a translator. He serves as a driver, a bodyguard maybe. And there's Darlington and his wife. This is where the cooking's done in one of these huts. This was Reason Marara's father's hut. And it was up there in his house. We went up and just visited briefly to get ready for our work. Okay, one last kind of local flavor. This was breakfast at the little lodge we stayed in Chifu. This is an English kind of breakfast. And the English, Look, going over there 3 times now, I've gotten used to the fact they will serve you baked beans for breakfast. That's common. This one was an unusual one in that it didn't have liver on it. They serve liver for breakfast. In fact, in Johannesburg, I had some chicken livers for breakfast. But, you know, it's just a different life. And it's a little different way of life with the British influence. You got to suffer hardships for the gospel sometimes. And the British, you know, they're tea lovers. It's hard to get a good cup of coffee in Zimbabwe, you know, because they like their tea. They do make good tea, but the next day, there we go. And this is, I have to think of my days. This is Thursday morning. And we visited the Church of Christ in Chivu, where Darlington preaches. And when we visit these, every time we go, they want both of us to preach. And we preach with a translator. We try to shorten our sermon some, but every word we say has to be repeated in their language. And it impresses me, the hunger for the word. That here that they are willing to gather on a Thursday morning. Several of them had to take off work to be there. They come and then they had to go back to work. They hunger for this word. Chivu's a little different, and I'll mention one other later in Rasapi. Most of the churches of Christ in Zimbabwe that are trying to hold to the pattern of New Testament organization, work of the church, what some might call non-institutional, most of them are found outside the cities. They're in the rural areas. This is a town church, though it's a very small town. But good people. And I apologize for how dark some of the pictures are, but the buildings they meet in do not have lights, electric lights. It's all natural light, and I don't want my flash going off when I'm taking pictures. On the left, you can see somebody had a truck there. And I'm not sure just how many people they crammed into the back of that truck as they hauled them off. But it's one of the things that struck me the first time I went was the men and women don't sit together, or rarely do they do that in a Zimbabwean church. And I mean even husbands and wives, they're separate sides. In some ways it's a cultural thing, but it is a reflection of their, well, one, they're not confused about genders. You know, they know the difference in a male and a female. But recognizing that the roles of men and women are different. And you will see in some pictures women sitting on the floor. If there are limited seats in Zimbabwe, the men take the seats and the women sit on the floor. And that just seems backwards to us. But it's a recognition, you know, and it's not just in the church. I mean, it's somewhat cultural, that the man was the head. And so when I read in Philippians 3:17 that Paul said about, we said that he had left an example. And then he said, note those who so walk as you have us for a pattern. I think that one of the things that always has struck me when I go there, and this was my 3rd trip, is the love of the Word of God that brings people out on a Thursday morning. You know, our crowd was not as big as it would have been if it had not been a school day. We would have had more school children there. But, you know, people who took off from work to come and be there and be a part of this. Well, that afternoon, we go up to Chavaki, which is near Chivu, but it's a country church, rural church. And the preacher is a brother named McDonald. And yes, McDonald had a farm. He had irrigation and a very nice farm. This is us standing with his family. I apologize for the shadows, but, that's where they stood us. But I want to mention about Chavaki a little bit, just real quick. And you can see the women sitting on the floor there. Reason Marara was translating for me. Excellent translator. He's more animated than I am. He gets to going, and when you preach with translation, there's a special challenge. If you're dealing with something that's really deep and kind of hard to explain, sometimes there's an advantage. You get to say what you're going to say, and while he's translating, you really get to think about how you want to say the next sentence. On the other hand, when you're preaching something and you really get to going and you're on a roll, it is so hard to have to stop, after a couple of sentences and let him, and then you kind of try to pick it back up. But these two men in the middle are brothers. And the one on the right is John Morrow, was his name. I'd never met him before. This was a new area to me. John Morrow was one of the men responsible for bringing the gospel to that area, to the establishment of that church in Chavaki in 1971. Remember what was said in Acts 8:4 about the disciples went out everywhere preaching the word? I'm thinking about this man 54 years after he was spreading the gospel there in Chavaki. There's still fruit being born. That ought to be an encouragement to us. To think about if we can teach someone, if we can, spread the good news of Jesus, that it can bear fruit for years to come. Much of Zimbabwe is very dry. They're in their dry period right now, and rain will be a rarity. And, much of it is like the savannah that you read about. But this next place is not. This next place is beautiful. It's almost on the Mozambique border. The mountains you see in the far distance, those are in Mozambique. And we're up pretty high in elevation above Matare. Beautiful, beautiful place that we did some preacher training classes. This trip was really about several things. And as they all are, this one's not unique. Number one, Romans 1:16, the gospel is the power of God unto salvation. And we go and we preach. I think I counted 11 different churches I preached in. And one of them, it was three different times. But we also go because of 2 Timothy 2 and verse 2. The things that you have heard from me among many witnesses, commit these to faithful men who will be able to teach others also. There are a lot of churches in Zimbabwe, a lot of churches of Christ that are trying to stand for truth, spreading the gospel. There are a limited number of experienced teachers. There are some. There are several men I know there who, if they could come to the United States, there are churches that would gladly have them preach for them. But they're limited. And sometimes men are forced into preaching within just a few months of being baptized because the need is so great. So we are trying, some of it working with those on a beginning level, but most of it maybe trying to help those who are a little bit more on an intermediate level, if that makes sense, to help them deepen their knowledge, to grow so that they might then be able to teach others also and teach on. And there it's called Vumba is the region that we focused on the church in Acts, and we talked about this. And during this time, I want to make mention, I've left it off a little earlier. I took a number of workbooks from Brother Joe Corley. Because of weight and space, I couldn't take as many as I'd have liked, but I gave them out to several men that I thought would make good use of them. I had put together some material, in fact, some material on the church that I had modified to fit Zimbabwe. I sent money over and had it printed there, and I gave this out at these classes. So, Brother Corley's material was distributed. Some of my class material was put out there, and hopefully will continue to bear fruit. And the classes are the number one thing. But if you look at Acts, the 28th chapter, and verse 15, part of what we do is along the lines of what happened with Paul as he's on his way to Rome. And it says in verse 15, from there, when the brethren heard about us, they came to greet us as far as Appii Forum and 3 Inns. When Paul saw them, he thanked God and took courage. These brethren that came and met Paul, it said they built him up in courage and strength. And sometimes it's not just the teaching we do. It's the being able to meet with these brethren, encourage them, to exhort them. And, here's I'm talking with a brother named Patamoyo. I just met him last year. I think a good young preacher. Everybody's young to me anymore, over there. But he's a good preacher from the Chippendeki area. And he and I talking, him relating some of the needs they have in the congregation, and us just talking. We do a lot of that. And one of the things we talked about, and I say this knowing that a number of brethren over there will be listening to this, is striving to get them to realize that they need to do as much as they can for themselves. In 2 Corinthians 8, it speaks of the Macedonians who gave out of their poverty, that they need to do what they can. 1 Corinthians 16, give as you've been prospered. Even when you're prospering is little, learn to give some. And we stress the preachers the need to do this. And I hope they take that and they apply it. But I'm just going to tell you, the needs are not just going to go away, especially in the rural areas. In the rural areas, most people live by subsistence farming. They've got their ancestral land, they farm it, and they are totally dependent upon the weather. If they don't get rain, they just don't get a crop. It doesn't happen for them. And Zimbabwe overall is a poor country. It may be improving a little. I see some signs of that. But it's a poor country, and there'll always be a need. But we were encouraging brethren, do all that you can do. But we'll also be there for you to try to help you. This is the 4 of us that did the Forest Hill study. The good-looking guy on the left, that's me. And yes, I am wearing that day a shirt, a very thick pullover, and the heaviest jacket I had, which was very thin, and wishing I'd had a heavier one. It was cool up there on the mountain. Then there's Steve, Lowell, and Kevin. And we tried to help them a little bit. Next morning, we got up early, Steve and I did. We drove about 2 hours that morning to be able to worship with Sim, a brother we support here at Oakland. And I'll have to say this, I really appreciate Steve works with me on this. I told him, I said, I'd really like to be able to see him on this trip. We'll talk about short in a little bit. That was already in the plans. But this was an out-of-the-way one. But he worked with me, and we visited with them at what's called Risapi Central. It is another town church. which again, as I say, a bit unusual. This is not their building. This is a school building. They rent a room from a school, which it does mean one thing. If you walk far enough, there are some actual restrooms at this place. Yet it's a good little walk to find them, but they do have restrooms on this. But again, Steve and I preached and worked with them, and then after that, we went out to Recipe Drift. Sim is working with two different churches. Central is in town. Recipe Drift, as they call it, it's out the dust road. And last year, I said something, and Tad Corder said, "Are you complaining?" I said, "Oh, no, I'm not complaining. I'm just stating the facts." And that's become kind of a joke among us all, that if something's bad, I'm not complaining. I'm just stating the fact. You know, there's no hot water today. I'm not complaining about it. It's just a fact. When you drive these dust roads, they will beat you to death. If there's a car in front of you, he will choke you to death. You know, but we go outside of town, and it's a good little ways out there. And we go out there and we find a group of people waiting on us. I want you to look at that little yellow arrow there. That's just a corner of the bench. The rest of it's cut off. Steve and I were given the seats of honor. Felt a little uncomfortable with that, you know, like the Pharisees, but they had a seat of honor up front for us on this bench. That was nice of them. But we were right in front of a window. And it was cold that day. The wind was blowing. And the wind is all funneling inside this window. So you were glad when it was your turn to get up and preach, because you could get out of the cold. But it was a good group of people. I didn't get to spend as much time with Sim as I would have liked, because we had to drive 2 hours. You had to drive in between the two churches where they meet. And then we had a long drive to get back to Harare that night afterwards. But I will say this, I was impressed favorably by both groups. Impressed by Sim and his family. One of the sad parts about this church is, and you may see over there in the corner some bricks. They've been told by the village council that their building is just not up to standards, which kind of boggles my mind in that area where they are. But they've been told by the village council they've got to construct a new facility. So they're currently making their own bricks. I don't know if they'll be able to salvage the roofing materials and some of that structure, but they're going to have to get a new place here. And here's Sim and Abigail. And the other picture, the one on the left, and I don't have all the names, but these are men, and Sim wanted me to get a picture of this, and I'm glad he did. These are men that he works with, and he is working to try to train them and use them, and they go out to other places to preach. It's not just Central and Drift. They're working with other churches, and you know, he's trying to bring these men along and teach them. And after that, we made a long drive back to Harare, and we don't like to be out on the road at night, but we couldn't help it that night. And it was one of those, we had hoped to stay in a place close to where we'd be working the next day, but just couldn't find lodging available. You know, I mean, there's certain things, it has to be secure, and you know, some things for us to stay there. The next morning, we went down to an area called Wedza, south of Harare, and we visited with 3 churches there, and I'm not going to tell you all about them, but I have to tell you one thing. I went to Wedza 2 years ago, there are at least 5 churches in that district. 3 men, Tawanda, Everson, and Innocent, work with them. They work with all 5. 2 of them are they just go up paths in the bush. I mean, you wouldn't even call it a road. It's just a path. You know, you're going up this, and none of your 4 tires were on the same plane. I mean, it was brutal. But we didn't visit them this year. We visited the ones closer to the town of Wedza. And some things are the same everywhere you go. 2 years ago, the road to Wedza was so brutal. It had one time been a paved road. Most of the asphalt had disappeared, but if nobody was coming, you could usually keep 2 wheels on that strip of asphalt. But if you met anybody, you had to get on, and it was just brutal. Now, a very prominent politician has a home down in the Wedza area. And would you believe it? The road has gotten better. I mean, it is paved, it's smooth. You know, it's really gotten good. I think I can relate to that here in America, how it works. But it was a Monday morning. And for the first time in 3 trips, I saw the rains down in Africa. It rained on us that morning. It was a cold rain. I'm guessing temperature somewhere in the 40s. You know, I've come from an Alabama summer. I didn't pack for that. It was cold down there. The buildings are unheated. You see these women sitting on that floor. That concrete would have been cold. But they sat there through 2 sermons. Steve and I, each of us preached 3 times that day at the 3 different churches. I don't know. It's hard to describe how encouraging it is to see people turn out on a day like that. And except for the preachers, I don't think anybody drove to that building. People walked in the cold rain. But we enjoyed some good hospitality. Somebody one time said to me, well, you know, they say it's really hard times in Zimbabwe, but everybody I look at in the picture seems kind of fat. Well, their diet is almost exclusively carbs. It's either rice, which that's what that, and you can see how much rice they put on my plate, or sudza, which is made from the finely ground corn they call mealy meal. They don't eat much protein. They eat they subsist on carbs. And this is another cooking hut, which I had to take a little duck inside there for a minute that day just to warm up. But, and the little child there, the little girl, that's the kind of heartwarming things that you see that, yes, it's cold. I'm a long ways from home, but here are these little children. Precious, precious, precious. Okay. The next day we went to Marawa, which is one of my favorite areas, north of Harare, northeast really. There are 4 churches in that area, and I'll mention in a moment. But I want you to look at this little scene right here. This stream at one time was the baptistry for what I used to sometimes call the church that shall not be named, Naya Hungurawe. And I think that's pretty close, and I'm proud of that. It is very, very remote. And this was their baptistry. But the water's gotten so low because of continued drought that they have to go further up the stream to baptize. And when they baptize in this stream, one of the things they have to do first is check for crocodiles. There are crocodiles in this stream. Jesus said we are to count the cost. When you agree to be baptized in a stream that you know may have a crocodile lurking somewhere nearby, you know, that you've counted the cost. You understand. But there are 4 churches there. Steve and I both visited at Nyahungarwe and Shavanawa. We separated. Steve went to Gosha. I went to Cambarami. And I know you won't remember all these names, but they're worth knowing. This is where Reason Marara, that's been our driver and translator, he's a member at the Shavanoa Church, though he works with all of them. And Tafwadza, who many in the States know as Calvin. I don't know why they decided to go with Calvin instead of Tafwadza. And then there's one named Tazvichka. Sounds like a Russian name, but he's usually called Taz. These three men work among these four churches. They've got two young men they are mentoring and developing, Martin and David, and they're good young men that they've got going. But we go out to Marara. None of these churches have an enclosed building. They all meet under what they refer to as a shade. You just got a metal roof over your head. It's wide open. It keeps the sun off your head. It keeps the rain off your head, unless it's blowing. Which it wasn't. The day we were there, it was nice enough. But I just want you to think about. I appreciate that Darren led Count Your Many Blessings. How blessed we are that we can meet in a climate-controlled building, and these people meet out in the open. And if you look, and I don't have a great shot of this, but when you stand usually at one of these shades, you can look in every direction. You don't even see a house. And keep in mind, we're meeting in the middle of the week, so the crowd's down a little bit. But Shavanoa on a Sunday will have nearly 100 people. And they all walk, some of them for miles, to get there. It's really challenging to see this. And there is one thing I wanted to point out, the kind of thing that sometimes people do. Up here at the top is a place called Cambarami. Way back here, those are the restrooms, or they will almost universally say toilets. There's that British influence again. First time I visited there, they didn't have that. It had not been completed. And I asked around among some friends, and we got together money and sent over so they could construct these. And there's nothing glamorous for an American about an outdoor toilet. But 3 years ago when I went, if you had to go, you just had to go and try to find a tree that would provide sufficient cover for you. They were glad to have that. Then there's Shavanoa. I want to make mention of this one just because I got a great picture of the benches they sit on. The people who are not sitting on the ground are sitting on these brick benches. Let's be honest. How many have sometimes said, these benches aren't as comfortable as, I'd like? How many of us have said, it's too hot in this building. It's too cold in this building. They're meeting in this open area, and that's the kind of thing they sit on. And, you see that cane that's in the picture? That's somebody who walked, who got there. They told me about a woman that's over 90 and is the first one at the building every time who walks. She gets there by walking. It's sobering and encouraging at the same time. Well, one of the things we did is we traveled from one end of the country to the other. Our preacher studies were way over here near Matari. A lot of our work was in this area. But then we fly to Victoria Falls, and then we drive over to Binga, and I'll tell you a little more about that in a moment. Steve and I got on a plane in Harare, flew to Victoria Falls, and there we got in around 10 o'clock that morning. And Steve had sent word to Joe that we would be in, our plane would land around 10. Well, Joe says to Tad, well, it'll, time they clear customs and everything, it'll be at least 10:30. So Peter Medenda, who preaches in Victoria Falls, was the driver. They show up at 10:30. We've been standing out there since 10 o'clock. When you fly within the country, you don't have to clear customs again. And trust me, we didn't let Joe forget that the whole trip, the rest of it. But we met back up with Joe and Tad there, and as I said, Peter Medenda picked us up, and we drove down to an area called Wangi, and that's where we met up with Short. Short, who is a man we support here at Oakland. And we drove to Binga. In my 3 trips to Zimbabwe, I experienced the worst roads I've ever ridden on. I didn't drive, no way. Couldn't pay me to do that. One thing, they drive on the wrong side of the road. But, I mean, I've been on some, short dust roads, some kind of trails through the bush to a place that were maybe as bad. We rode for probably 2.5 hours or more just getting beat to pieces, and, there were really, really bad roads. When people think about the poverty there, I saw something that I think is worth mentioning. Why are they poor? Why? Some of the cities are doing fairly well. But the bigger cities have almost no churches that I could feel comfortable worshiping with. Most of them are in either very small towns or the very rural bush districts. But we saw a coal mine operating in Binga, or between Wanga and Binga, owned by the Chinese. We saw a lithium mine owned by a Chinese corporation. China is moving in and creating some jobs. But as one of the 2 preachers, and I think it was Short, that said to me that they've had some Christians go to work for these mines owned by the Chinese. And they run the mines 7 days a week. They tell the workers, said, we pay you to work. We don't pay your Jesus to work. And there may be some money involved, but they can cut off all your worship. Most of the churches there are only going to meet on Sunday morning because it's hard to meet in the dark. When you have buildings with no electricity, you have these shades, you've got to meet during the daytime. You got to leave people time to get home before it gets dark. So that may help the overall economy of Zimbabwe. But for right now, it's not much of an answer for a Christian. And as you look at these pictures, I want you to notice that center one. Livestock are a real menace when you're driving. That's the number one reason we try not to be out after dark. If you live in Limestone County, and if you lived here long enough, you've seen the black cow in the dark of the night. They're hard to see. Cows are hard to see at night. Goats are everywhere, but the goat won't do the damage a cow will do. They're all over. Well, why don't we keep them pinned up? During the dry season, if you want to keep livestock, your only chance of keeping them alive is to let them go and forage. They go and they try to find whatever they can, and you see cows eating leaves off trees and things and such. It's a way of survival. And the picture on the right, that's an overturned lithium truck hauling it from the mine, and we barely got around it. But we get to Binga, and On the left is a picture of Short with his mother. His mother lives just up the road from where we were going to have the studies. I'll tell you about that in a moment. But in the center, there is Joe standing with Short in front of a baobab tree. That is a monster. That is a monster tree that was right there by where we had the studies. You want inspirational? Check out this man over here on the far right. Almost said in the orange shirt, and I'm glad I turned around because it looks brown in this picture, but up here. Peter Medenda said that this man had walked about 6 hours to get to these studies. You can sort of see in the background there are mountains. He walks 6 hours to grow in his knowledge of God's word and his ability to teach others. After 2.5 days of study, guess how far he has to walk to get home? It's going to be another 6 hours. That kind of thing encourages you. Well, we had the Binga studies in 2 places. The Matibi church building that's the one on the left. That's where we had some of it. And on the same general property, it was real close by, there was an abandoned house. A man had a house with 3 rooms. And we had students in all 3 rooms. And we taught in there. Here we had to divide people up. In Forest Hills, we did all our classes in English. Here, they kind of divided up the ones they thought understood enough English and had enough basic knowledge. They were over in the Matibi church building. And the ones that didn't know English, they were in the little house, and we used a translator. Which, again, it slows you down a little bit in your teaching. But we were able to get through. But ingenuity is a great thing. I think it was Peter who had the generator, but it may have been Short. They brought a gas-powered generator and hooked up, and we had PowerPoint in these buildings. There's no electricity, no running water. I didn't bother taking a picture of the outside toilet that was here, but we still had PowerPoint. 1 Corinthians 9, in verse 22, Paul said, I have become all things to all men that I might by all means save some. I don't want to say I'm great at this, but if you're going to work and do productive work in an area like that, you have to be willing to adapt to some things that might not be up to American standards. The picture on the right is the kitchen where some ladies prepared our food each day. Yeah, they built fires down on the ground and they cooked for us out in the open sun. The next time you read Romans 16 and you see all those names of ladies, these are the kind of ladies that if I were writing a letter, they'd be in there. They worked hard to feed all of these preachers who've got. There was no McDonald's down the road. There was nowhere, we couldn't say, okay, it's lunchtime. One, they couldn't have afforded to go in there if there had been. In the towns, there's a very popular chain called Chicken Inn. We were nowhere near a Chicken Inn. So these ladies, and by the way, a lot of the food that was being served those preachers came from money that folks here gave me. I sent money ahead of time to Short, and he bought food, and these ladies cooked. And I learned this: roast goat is not that bad. It is pretty good. The boiled goat, it wasn't quite as good. And the piece of boiled intestine, okay, that's where I drew the line. I just, I couldn't quite go with that one, but it was incredible sacrifice on their part. And these people, their desire to learn was so good. We had Q&A sessions. It allowed me to tell, I know I got to hurry up. But over here on the left, of course, you recognize that's Joe Greer, the man that comes to the airport late for you. But his translator is a man named Last. Yes, L-A-S-T. He was the fourth child, and his dad said Last. And that's the name they gave him, and he was done. Last was an impressive man. He's recently received his college degree. He's working in some type of medical field. He's not a doctor, but he's working at a hospital, but wanting to do this preaching work. And so he takes time off and comes there to learn. After that, we were on to Victoria Falls. We did half a day of classes on Saturday. We did 2.5 solid days of classes, from early in the morning till late. The six of us, that is Joe and Tad and Steve, myself, Peter and Short, we were staying at this old fishing camp. We were on Lake Kariba, which is off a part of the Zambezi River. We were 15 miles from where the studies were going on. Okay, 20, 25-minute drive. It was close to an hour each way because of the condition of the road, which, had we realized all that, we might have made some different arrangements. But the place where we stayed, it was what you would call adequate. When they cranked the generator and ran it, we had electricity and Wi-Fi. When they didn't, one morning you take a shower by the light from your cell phone. You turn that little light on and you try to get a shower. But it is what it is. You deal with it and you go on. But we do the morning classes at Binga. Then we get in the truck and we ride over those horrible roads to Victoria Falls. And that night, they called it a gospel meeting at Chamabando, which is in Victoria Falls. And it's a Saturday night. I preached once. Tad preached once. Excuse me. We got up the next morning. I preached. Tad preached. We came back that night. We both preached. And by this time, I'm losing my voice. The air is extremely dry. And after we got out of Wedza with that one rain, the air is so dry. And it's so dusty because it's so dry. It is incredibly dry there. But we had good interest there. And on Monday night, Steve and Lowell preached. They ran their meeting Saturday, Sunday, Monday. And we wrapped it up. And that pretty much wraps up my part of the work. But I want to make mention of comfort, moyo to some, comfort, diwa to others. The church here sends him money each time for food relief, each month or however often for food relief. Comfort is from down in Bulawayo and wasn't going to be able, we weren't going there. But he had said he really would like to meet with me while I was there, so I provided him with some fuel money. Again, because of your generosity, I could do that. And he came up and brought a young man named Austin that preaches in that area. And then Joe reached out to a couple of men, a brother, and I know this is not exactly how it's pronounced, but Mancini, whose wife had died just a few weeks ago. And Mancini came up with comfort and brought a brother named Tondo with him. And they got to spend Sunday night and Monday with us. And, we just, got to spend some good time with these men and encourage them in their work. But comfort was giving me a little more detail. There are about 21, I think there are 21, not about, there are 21 churches, about 650 people. And he said he does his best to try to make the benevolence fit the need. Not just go in and say, okay, every family line up and you get 10 kilograms of meal, you get this much of oil, you get this much sugar. he said, every family doesn't have the same need. And I can appreciate that's a lot more work. It'd be a lot easier just to say, okay, I got 50 bags of meal, just distribute them. Here we go. With the end of this, I want to just give you an idea. The blue arrow points to where Comfort lives. The star represents the area where he distributes the relief. He has to drive out there, and there's a lot of expense in that. The red arrows, that's the area of Short. And there are two of them. He preaches and lives in Wangi. But he also travels over to the region of South Binga, or Binga South, as often as he can. With gas at $5.80 a gallon, it's not always possible to get over there as much as he would like. But he goes over there sometimes 2 weeks out of the month, if he can, working with a lot of the rural churches. I know while I was there, I just saw a little snapshot, a little snippet. But I can tell you, I feel good about being in fellowship with that man in the work of the gospel. The yellow arrow, if you can see it, it points to the area where Brother Sim is. Didn't get to be with him as much, but again, I got a very favorable impression of the churches and the work being done there. Well, I've gone longer than I wanted to, but honestly, not as long as I feared I would. I could talk a lot more about these people, these places. I could have stuck the pictures of the giraffe in there. We're coming back from Wedza. I just had to, you pass through a game park. I mean, it's fenced on both sides. On my fourth time through there, for the first time we saw some wildlife. We saw, over there in the park, some giraffes and some zebras. But was the trip a success? People say, was it a good trip? Well, the reality is, only God knows what was accomplished in this. But here are some things that I know happened. The gospel was preached. I've spoken in 11 different churches. What did I preach? I preached a lot of the same kind of things you'd preach here. I preached on 1 Corinthians 15:58. I preached on drinking. I preached on Matthew 7:21 through 23. I preached Isaiah 12 at Rosapi Central. We preached the gospel. And we left behind some good study materials. Things that people can keep and work from. I know the brethren were encouraged. They told us that while we were there. I've gotten a number of messages. And it's not about me. Just the group of us go and help them. I believe men were strengthened in their abilities to teach. That I know when we do these kind of classes, these preacher classes, some of it goes over the head of some. But I know that there are others who take it in. They will build upon it themselves, and they will pass it on to others. And you can't ask for more than that. And then I ask you to do this. I ask you to continue to pray. I know you prayed for us while we were on that trip. You prayed for me especially. And again, I don't have the proper words to express my appreciation for that. But continue to pray for these brethren. Life is hard. It's hard when you plant a crop and you just don't know if the rain's going to fall at the right time. It's hard when you walk for miles to sit either on the ground or a brick bench. And yet, their faith in God is strong. Pray that it continue to be strong. And pray for them that the rains do come. there was a brother, I believe at Shavanoa, an older man, who he thought that we were part of the relief effort. I think East Side actually helps him a lot. But he came up, and I believe there were tears in his eyes when he said, "I just want to thank you." He said, "We were starving." You know, that these people face very great difficulties. I pray for them to get rain. I pray regularly that there be rain to fall upon their crops. But even more, I pray that their faith will be strong, whether the rain comes or it doesn't come. And I'd ask you to do the same. In just a moment, we're going to sing that song of invitation. And I hope you'll think about the faith of people who can love God, can worship enthusiastically, hold their faith in times like that, and look inside yourself and say, why don't I love the Lord more? If you're not a Christian, why have I not obeyed the gospel? If people will brave crocodiles to have their sins washed away, what's holding me back? What's keeping me? If we can help you this evening to make your life right with God, you come as we stand, sing together.